Our second speaker today is Lisa Herzog from Frankfurt. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt and also within the Excellence Cluster Normative Orders at the Goethe University Frankfurt. She studied philosophy, economics, political science, and modern history in Munich and Oxford, and she wrote her PhD thesis on markets and political theory in the works of Adam Smith and Hegel as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. Her PhD thesis won the Sir Ernest Barker Prize for Political Theory of the Political Studies Association for the best dissertation in political theory. In 2012, she also won the prestigious Ernst Bloch Prize, a prize for outstanding scientific and literary works with a philosophical grounding, awarded every 3 years by the Ernst Bloch Center and the city of Ludwigshafen am Rhein. Lisa Herzog has worked at Technical University Munich and at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. She has spent the academic year 2014-15 at the Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University. She works at the intersection of political philosophy and economics. Lisa Herzog's first book is Inventing the Market, Smith, Hegel, and Political Theory, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. In 2014, she published Freiheit gehört nicht nur den Reichen, Plädoyer für einen zeitgemäßen Liberalismus, Freedom not just for the rich, a plea for a well-understood liberalism for a broader audience. She has published scholarly articles in German and English on Adam Smith, Hegel, non-ideal theorizing, markets, and virtue ethics. She has also edited 2 volumes, one entitled Hegel's Thought in Europe, Currents, Cross-Currents, Countercurrents, a translation from German, and the other together with Axel Honneth, entitled The Worth of Markets, a philosophical economic discourse from the 18th century to the present. Currently, Lisa Herzog works on a book project on ethical agency in organizational contexts and on questions of ethics in finance. And in 2015-16, Lisa will return to a postdoc position in Frankfurt and a research project on ethics in financial markets. Today, Lisa Herzog's lecture bears the title, The Game You're In, Social Norms and How They Can Be Abused. Please.
So thank you for this kind invitation. I've actually changed the title a little bit to refer to the theme of this conference. And when I saw the fist in the cloth that is on the poster for the conference, I thought, oh, this is exactly what you feel like when you are in one of those situations that I'm going to focus on. Now, of course, it's very difficult to say something new about social justice, and you want something new here, which I gather from the subtitle of the conference. So here's a short version of what my new contribution is: Theories of Justice, read Bourdieu. Now we can all go and have coffee. No, just kidding. What I'm going to talk about today is how social norms can perpetuate social injustices in ways that seem very sort of micro phenomena, that seem mild and tiny things that individuals feel, that individuals get angry about, but that have nothing to do with large-scale social inequalities. But that's not how I see it, and I think we need to think much more about the connection between micro and macro effects and levels. So let me start with a story, and this story will sound as if it has nothing to do with social justice, but I'll let you know what the connection is later on. So I did a series of interviews for my book project on ethics in organizations, and one guy, and I call him Andy here, told me a story where he was genuinely unsure about whether he had done something morally wrong or whether it was okay to behave in the way in which he did. So the story is this: he is an engineer in a company, and he has to negotiate with the people from a different company about a project. And first they talk business, and they talk about money and budgets and so on, and they are all very strategic, and they all try not to let the other party know how much money they have because they want to get a good deal and so on. And then after a while they walk over to the lab and they have a look at the experiments, and they get really excited about all the engineering issues there, and they look at the technical details and what they could do, how they could make this work. And then suddenly Andy turns to the other party saying, well, that's a good idea, we couldn't do this, but actually, do you have enough budget for that? And the other party is caught completely by surprise, and the guy tells him what his budget is, which he definitely wouldn't have done when they talked business in the first part of the conversation. And Andy didn't show that he had just managed to score a really important strategic point. It just goes on with the technical details. But now he knows what the other party's budget is, and so he can write a proposal that is exactly giving the other party enough that the deal is going to come about, but getting his own interests served in the best way. So he's changing the conversation, raising the question in a place where you wouldn't expect it, and then the other party just falls into this trap. Now, you might be torn about how you see this case. You might think, oh, what a clever guy. That's exactly what we should do more often. Or you might think, oh, this is really sort of unfair. How can you just trick the other party, abuse their trust, lead them down the garden path, and abuse the trust that you have among engineers in this way? And the intuition that I have here is that these kind of phenomena are not just happening among engineers in business negotiations, but are much more widespread. And what's at stake here is to know which game you're in. And I think that misleading others about the game that is being played is a form of injustice that takes place below the radar, as it were, of formal institutions, of legal issues, but which can nonetheless be very powerful in perpetuating inequalities. And so my suggestion here is in that sense that it is one kind of micro-foundation of social injustice. I'm not saying it's the only one. I'm also not saying it's the most important one. I think there are many, and they often interact in very powerful ways. But given that we live in increasingly unjust, unequal societies, I mean, depending on what we mean by social justice, but increasing unequal societies, I think that's something we can agree on, these mechanisms are, I think, getting more important. And you can make both direct arguments about what's wrong with them, but you can also make an indirect argument for thinking about social justice, for the importance of social justice from these kinds of wrongs and how they continue and perpetuate inequalities. So I'm going to say a bit more about this phenomenon of misleading others about the game you're in. And then I'll make the connection to social justice. Then I'll explore some ideas about what actually makes it wrong and in what cases it is wrong to mislead others about the game one is in. And I'll conclude with a few practical implications for social justice. So it's sort of a cliche that we live in a knowledge economy and knowledge-intense societies and so on. But it is also a matter of fact that in our societies, labor is extremely divided. And you have lots of different communities working in different areas and often not talking to one another. And all of us rely on clues about which situation we are actually in and the social norms that are appropriate for different situations. Now, these differences between different spheres and the social norms that govern those different spheres is something that philosophers have not taken very seriously until rather recently. There are a few other issues, and I can say more about this if you like. And I think there's another talk on epistemic justice tomorrow, so I'll not anticipate this. But there are huge questions that arise if you take those sociological processes seriously and look at them from a perspective of justice. So you already mentioned this. We have different spheres. I'm not endorsing a theory of justice here. I'm just saying there are lots of theorists who have told us that we have those different spheres in society, starting with Hegel, if you like, the family, civil society, and the state, and Walter with the different spheres of justice, and many others. And the basic picture that they give us is that our societies are cut up into those different chunks, different social spheres with different rules, different values, different practices, and so on. And in those different spheres, there are different expectations about what kind of behavior we can expect from others, and also how we should behave. And those concerns things like how much you're allowed or supposed to pursue your self-interest, how much do you expect others to pursue their self-interest, how trustful should you be, how honest should you be, and so on. And the way in which Hegel and Walzer and many people describe these fears makes it look as if it's always quite clear where we are. So it's like big chunks of the social realm. This is family, this is business, this is the political realm. But sometimes, and actually I think very often, the relationship between different spheres is more complex, and you have really interwoven and changing relationships between those spheres. If you want an extreme example, think about two people who are married to one another and also work in a similar field. So they always have to negotiate those boundaries between their private relationship as a family and their professional relationship as colleagues. And often we rely on social cues for understanding which game we are currently in. And we often do so more or less unthinkingly. There's a very nice experiment that you might have heard of, which is called the Wall Street game and the community game. And you know how those behavioral economists work? They have the completely identical setup. It's a prisoner's dilemma or some commons game where people are asked to contribute something. And it's exactly identical payoffs in the two scenarios. But in one case, it's called the Wall Street game. In the other case, it's called the community game. And guess what? People behave quite differently. Now, I know there has been this replication crisis in social psychology. I don't know whether they try to replicate this game or experiment, but I find it very plausible to think that if you call something the Wall Street game, people think about it as something that is about money and that is competitive and where you have to expect others to be competitive and to be money-oriented. So that triggers self-interested reactions. Whereas if you call something the community game, that means, okay, this is something where we are all in the same boat, we do something together, there are social norms around this, and so people behave in a more cooperative way. And there are also many other experiments that show that people are what economists call conditional cooperators. So if you think others are going to cooperate, you are willing to cooperate as well. But if you expect others to defect, in prisoner's dilemma language, then it's more likely that you defect as well because you want to defend your own interests. This is, if you like, a very Hobbesian insight. Even if you're well-intended and you want social peace, if you can't be sure that the others are also cooperative, then maybe you have to go into defensive mode as well. Now, the problem often is that we need to know what kind of game we are in, and both within games and also between games, we can be misled by others. And by others, I mean not only other individuals, but also advertisement, the way you're treated at a job interview. Lots of relations between individuals or individuals and institutions where those things play a role, and it plays a role what kind of game you think you're in and what kind of game the others think you're in. So to give you another example, when you have job negotiations, there is often this moment when it switches from, do we want you to get the job at all, when you're just one among many candidates, to the mode of, okay, we think you're the best candidate, now we need to negotiate about the conditions. And if you don't realize when this change happens, you might be far too defensive when it comes to negotiating the deal you get in a job. So, if you want to preserve your own interests, you can try to mislead others about the game you're in order to get them to behave in what's the wrong way, as it were. Now, if you give them no information at all, this usually elicits caution, and people have the default position of being very careful and skeptical about what's going on. So this is not a very clever strategy. But what you can do is you give them information that seems to suggest that you are actually in a game in which you can trust. So, for example, what Andy did, he asked a question in a situation where they were really among colleagues, as it were, discussing the technical details, sharing knowledge about the technical things that were going on there. So people were less cautious, and that's why they let out this piece of information. So you can exploit social habits about those norms, and by doing so, you can sometimes rely on what are not fully rational traits of human nature. So we instinctively think this is a different kind of situation. There are certain kinds of websites that talk to us in a certain way, so very casual, very friendly, which seems to suggest that this is something community-based, let's say, and in reality it's actually a rip-off scheme, it's all about profits, but they try to suggest that you're actually in a safe space here and nothing will happen if you're a little bit too trustful. Now, what's so tricky about those kind of phenomena is you don't have to use direct lies here. The game is sort of get the other person in the wrong room and then see how you can deal with them. You don't have to lie to them, which is often morally and legally problematic, and you might get sanctioned. You also don't have to do something that philosophers have discussed a lot, which is misleading by implication. So there is a famous example by Bernard Williams. If you say, someone opened your mail, the other person is usually not going to think that you opened the mail, because the phrase suggests that a third person did it, but grammatically, it's also correct that the someone who opened the mail could have been you. But this is just not something the other person would usually expect. Now, those kinds of misleading by implication are usually quite complex and require some thinking, and you need to construct the situation, or sometimes you can also use non-verbal cues. But it takes a lot of effort, and most people would think that it is as wrong as lying. But if you mislead others about the game that is being played, you avoid those questions, you don't have to make all the efforts, and it's not so clear what's going on morally speaking, and lots of people are not so sure whether it's morally wrong to do this, whereas they would say it's wrong to lie in most situations, and that it's also wrong to mislead by implication. Now, the case I gave you about Andy and the other engineer, that was a symmetrical case, if you like. Or we can assume that it was a symmetrical case. So they were on a par, they are both experts. Let's assume that the companies are not in total imbalance of power. So in a sense, you could describe this as a pure case. And this case is interesting for theoretical reasons, but I also think it's quite rare in real life to have really pure cases, and it's not so interesting for social justice. But most of those things take place against a background of huge asymmetries. Now, what kinds of asymmetries do we have? There can be unequal market power, or there can be unequal exit options. For example, if you think about employers and employees, at least in countries where most people depend on employment for getting an income. You could also have a situation where you have one firm and many customers who are not organized, and so it's more difficult for them to talk to the company as a group. So that creates asymmetries. So just general issues about unequal power. But then you can also have more subtle differences, and as I said at the beginning, I think they seem subtle, but they are very powerful in practice. And this is where Bourdieu comes in, because Bourdieu has provided us with this theory and rich empirical material, and also the concepts for describing social and cultural capital. And when you think, especially, for example, about higher education, justice in higher education, job interviews, all the social norms about how you're supposed to behave in different industries or in different companies. Just think about two candidates, one whose parents work in the same field and one who comes from a background where no one has ever been in this field, and think about how difficult it is for the second person to understand all the social norms, all the games that might be played in a certain field. And then there's a third way, which I think is even more complicated, and where lots of sort of conservative right-wing people would say, oh, this is just the individual's fault. But I think it's more complicated. So if you have individuals in different positions, there might also be differential incentives to acquire the knowledge about different games that might be being played. So a simple case, and hopefully a little bit outdated case, is if you have a young woman who has been brought up with this expectation that she always has to be nice, and that it's always going to backfire if she's not the nice girl. Why would she even try to acquire knowledge and an understanding of really tough business negotiations? Because she can't expect that she will be able to play this game at all. So why would you try to understand what's going on there if you don't expect to ever be part of that game anyway? And now, of course, this is a complicated area because there is a question about, is it the individual's responsibility to try to learn those things, or at least make some efforts, or is it all the society's fault or the fault of specific individuals who fail to motivate people to acquire this knowledge or help them acquire this knowledge? But I would say that we can think about cases where it's really quite plausible that people couldn't expect that they would ever be in a situation where they would need certain knowledge, and therefore we cannot expect them to make the effort to acquire that kind of knowledge. And structurally speaking, all those asymmetries introduce biases in favor of experienced individuals who know what game is being played, or those who are close to them. And now this is a sort of neutral, structural way of putting it. Often it means those who are already in positions of power, who have sometimes having more money can help you to acquire the knowledge, even if you don't have it because of your position. But I think it's pretty clear that those kinds of biases tend to work to the disadvantage of excluded groups, excluded along many lines that we talk about when we talk about social justice. And it's compatible with equal formal structures. So they can all have the same rights, same equality of opportunity in a formal sense. That doesn't even touch upon those issues. Now, what makes it wrong to mislead others about the game you're in? I'm going to start again with a pure case, but then I'll get to the more real-life issues about asymmetrical cases very quickly. So from a consequentialist perspective, you might say it's just a question of balancing people's interests. If your interest, your ability to pursue your interests is undermined because the other party doesn't tell you which game you're in, you might feel, oh damn, what game are they playing? They are not allowing me to pursue my interests, and there's something wrong with that. And a consequentialist might say, well, depending on what balances of welfare they have, this could be wrong. But then the question is, does this capture all that's going on here? And does it capture the kind of resentment and frustration that people feel when they are treated in that way? Now, I mentioned that other philosophers have written about similar phenomena. There's one piece by Tamar Shapiro where she talks about a slightly different phenomenon, but it's also about being in a joint practice, and then one party violates this practice, and you end up what she calls serving a unilateral will. So it's about manipulation instead of respect. And it's also, in many cases, about exploiting someone's less than fully rational features, you might say. So this reliance on social cues, the tendency to be nice to someone who's nice to you, to react in the way that you think is the appropriate way. Sometimes we do this just instinctively, and then later on we realize, oh, this was really just to mislead us, and then we get this angry fist in our pocket, maybe. But this is something where you cannot really reveal what you're doing without undermining what's going on. If you tell the other party, look, I'm trying to mislead you about the game that's being played, then of course you can't mislead them anymore. Although there is a question about to what degree we can really control this subconscious behaviors, but it should be pretty clear that there is something about violating the categorical imperative here. Now, there's an objection to this, and this objection is, no, this is too fast. We live in complex societies, and sometimes we just agree to be in certain situations where it's justified that you're being treated strategically. And you've sort of agreed to this because you've entered the sphere, as it were. And of course, this is very often said about the market. The market is a jungle, and if you participate in the market, then you must expect everyone to be self-interested. The sociology of markets tells us a different story, and if you think, for example, about the way in which advertisement works, the way in which B2B contacts work, markets have also a lot to do with trust, and markets aren't as such the one big sphere where self-interest is the norm. It's more subtle and more complex, and this is also why there can be these ways of misleading others. There is an interesting discussion by Arthur Applebaum on adversarial ethics, and this is about how you should behave if you're in a situation where you have to expect the other side to be in an adversarial relation to you. He focuses mostly on lawyers in court cases where the two parties are playing really, hard games and try to win the case for their clients. And he says there are 5 conditions under which it would be permissible to not behave according to normal, ordinary morality, i.e. to be less moral than you'd usually be, for example, to lie or to deceive or to manipulate, to withhold information and so on. And I'm not going to run through these in detail, but basically what he's telling us, there can be situations in which it can be justified to use those immoral practices, but the conditions on those situations are really strict and they hardly ever apply. Because you hardly ever have the kind of asymmetry and the usefulness of the game as a whole, where you could really say, okay, it's okay to lie to my opponent here because that's what the situation requires. So his line is, there can be such situations, but they are really rare, and it's very easy to rationalize wrong behavior by claiming, oh, that's what the situation requires, I'm in an adversarial relation here. He says, be more careful here. There's also another suggestion for conceptualizing this by Dees and Crampton, where they say, well, we have to distinguish situations of mutual trust from situations of what they call shrewd bargaining. And again, the point is not that we cannot find cases where this is actually true. The point is that those situations are probably much rarer than what we take to be. So, which cases are really so pure? And there's one extreme example that I found in a newspaper report in The Guardian recently where I thought, oh, this is obviously a case where most people, I think, would agree that this is wrong. So there was a group of environmental activists and there was a police agent who was supposed to report on their activities because they were suspected to be quite militant and maybe, break into companies or whatever, do illegal things. And one of those police agents actually pretended to enter into language gets complicated here. This guy actually really entered into a relationship, a love relationship with one of the activists, and never revealed to her that he was a police agent. And this woman never asked him, are you a police agent? Because when you date someone, you wouldn't expect that they are doing it for the sake of spying on you. So this is a case where I think most people would agree that it's wrong to pretend that you're in one kind of game when it's actually a very different game. So the question then is, which games are permissible and which ones are not permissible? And I think in order to answer this question, we need to take a little bit of a more macro perspective and think about what's really at stake here. If more and more people, let's assume sort of on a scale, use the strategy of misleading others. So what's at stake, I think, is the possibility of having different spheres with different social norms at all, where you have different levels of trust, different expectations about honesty, and so on. Because the default option, if you don't have this differentiation, would be that wherever we go, in whatever social sphere we move, we have to be as cautious as we can, never trust anyone, always be on your guard. That's what you'd have to do if there were no social norms about trust and different kinds of behavior. Now you might say, that's just what the world is like, it's tough out there, go deal with it. But I think that's quite an inappropriate answer, because if you think about how human capacities work, it's pretty wrong to have this Descartesian picture where we all those atomistic selves and we all pursue our interests in a world that is somehow unstructured and doesn't influence us. I mean, that's what economists sometimes think, or the caricature of economists. Instead, and philosophers of mind have really written a lot about this recently, human beings use external structures, social structures, also technical structures, to scaffold, as it's called, their own capacities. The most simple example is you use pen and paper to scaffold your memory, and lots of cultural techniques are really there in order to strengthen our capacities, help us become better at different things. And it's not as if we had this Cartesian mind inside ourselves and then there's a world out there. It's really the interaction of our minds and the world out there that helps us to do what we think we can do. And part of that infrastructure is also a cultural infrastructure, if you like, where we can rely on certain norms for certain social spheres and adapt to the kind of behavior that's going on there. And I think on the whole, we can say that we benefit from having a plurality of games and not just one kind of game where it's always the same rules and the same expectations. But if that is true, then we also need to think about how we mark the boundaries between those different games. And I guess most of you would recognize the situation of how unsettling it is when you are in a situation where you don't know which game is being played, or you realize that you are somehow in the wrong game, you made the wrong assumptions. And this is a very existential angst that comes up in those situations. And if you cannot trust any of the norms that you're given, because you always have to anticipate that you might be being misled about them, then in a way you have to feel this angst all the time, and you can never ever rely on others really behaving according to the norms of what you think the game is. So the danger here is that we are really unraveling all the norms and people cannot trust them at all anymore. And of course, this is especially problematic if we have unequal societies. So I'm going to jump across this issue here. We can use lots of different philosophical concepts from epistemology and applied epistemology for describing this. I think the important thing is that usually the cases we talk about are asymmetrical cases that are taking place against the background of social injustice. And misleading others about the game they are in can be a way of protecting social privilege that doesn't violate norms of formal equality, but that can still be quite effective. Now, come to the conclusion. What implications follow from these considerations? So you might ask whether we should have better legal regulation for changing those practices. And sometimes that's the right answer. When you think about misleading advertisement, for example, where they trick you into thinking something is for free and then actually you have to pay a lot, or whether if they want to sell you a mortgage and it's actually much more expensive than you can afford, there is a place for legal regulation there and for consumer protection and so on. But many of those practices, especially those between individuals, are below the radar of legal regulation. And there we really get to questions about what Jerry Cohen has called an ethos of social justice, where we do see one another as equals and we try to contribute to realizing a society in which we all have equal status. And there's one idea, again from social epistemology by Baudewind de Prain in his recent book, which is on financial markets, and I think financial markets are an area where we have loads of phenomena like this. And he talks about this ideal of interlucency, where two parties take joint responsibility for making sure that the conversation is successful, that everyone knows what's being played, and that the other party really understands what's going on. So he says the recipient has to acknowledge receipt of the message and must try to make clear how she understands the message. Both sender and recipient have to contribute to sufficient openness concerning the communication and interpretation strategies they use in order that epistemic generosity, that's another notion he uses, gets off the ground. So this is really about the co-responsibility of making sure everyone knows which game they are in. Now, one area that I already mentioned where this is really coming up, I think, quite often is between individuals and institutions or organizations in a broader sense. And as long as we have this idea of consumer sovereignty, which I think is very problematic in many ways, there's always going to be this tension of, okay, consumers are supposed to be sovereign, so they are supposed to know what they are doing. So why should there be any need for protecting them against making mistakes? But then, of course, there are different kinds of mistakes. There are mistakes where individuals behave really in a stupid way, and they should be given the opportunity to learn, if you like. But then there are also many cases where it's really a way of misleading others that is treating them in an unfair way, and that serves to reinforce social inequalities. And I think one really has to question this notion of consumer sovereignty, especially when it comes to important decisions like buying a home, buying health insurance, and so on, where you have path dependencies and relations to other areas of social justice. There is a real question about whether those markets should be such that it's a jungle, as people say, or whether we need more responsible behavior there, this ideal of interlucency maybe, and they need to be regulated differently. Now, I would totally concede that there can be a lot of disagreement about why we need protection in different areas and which cases justify interventions. And I think there is also some degree of judgment needed. It depends on the kinds of societies you live in. It depends on context. For example, in Germany right now we have this huge influx of migrants, so they will have a hard time understanding how German society works. I often have a hard time understanding how German society works. So there are real questions there about how they can learn what games are being played there and how they can be protected from being exploited by people who try to mislead them by abusing social norms. And you might say, okay, all fine, but social justice is really just about distribution. The thing is, the more inequality we have, and this is where I'm coming to my conclusion, the more difficult it gets to prevent those kinds of mechanisms and to prevent a stratification of social experiences, social classes, and so on, that makes it even easier for those in a position of privilege to mislead others. So this is why I think that this relation between the micro and the macro is so important. As I said, I don't think it's the only phenomenon that plays a role in those contexts. There are lots of others, and social psychology and sociology are discovering new effects on a monthly basis, as it were. And I guess you've all read about the new research that's coming up all the time on biases and stereotype threat and those things that have a real impact on how resources and positions are distributed in societies. It's a really difficult question to what degree we need to understand games in order to change them, or whether we can change them from the outside. Also, some games should probably simply be abolished from a moral perspective. I'm not saying that all games that we have in our societies are morally justified. But if we don't understand the games that are being played, this can be a blockade for reform efforts. And so there's a real question about how those who are already inside and those who want to change games can maybe cooperate in order to share the relevant knowledge. And on the normative level, I think those kinds of experiences are often ways in which social injustice and inclusion or exclusion are experienced that get this very existential meaning for people, where you really feel, okay, I'm somehow not part of the game here. What's going on? I don't understand it, maybe only retrospectively. And where individuals try to understand whether it's just their own fault, that's what you might think in the first place, or whether there's something broader going on. And finally, there's this indirect argument that I mentioned at the outset. The more unequal societies are, the more they get split up into different groups and classes and whatever, communities maybe, the more difficult it gets to deal with those mechanisms and the greater the likelihood that it happens. And sometimes it might even happen unintentionally. So some groups, privileged groups, might practice those forms of inclusion because they just think everyone knows the game and they don't realize how difficult it is for others to learn what the game is. So I think we can make an argument here that there is a reason to want to keep inequalities at a certain level, not let them get larger, because that makes it less likely that those mechanisms happen. Now, of course, there are lots of empirical issues here about when does it happen, how much does economic inequality impact on other forms of inequality, but in different societies, I think you can observe that you have those structures where those mechanisms happen. And I think we need to take those micro issues seriously in order to fully understand what's happening at the macro scale. Thank you very much.